I'm Cynthia Edenburg. I research and teach the field of Bible at the Open University in Israel. And I am here to talk to you today about how a story about the conquest of Canaan under Joshua can reflect the concerns of the Persian period in Judah. The story I wish to discuss today is that of the Gibeonites. But who are the Gibeonites? Gibeon is a town located 10 kilometers northwest of Jerusalem, and according to the book of Joshua, its inhabitants were non-Israelites, but they were allowed to dwell among the Israelites thanks to a peace treaty which they had established with the Israelites. However, archaeologists and historians have taught us that the settlements of the hill country from pre-monarchic Israel do not reflect the waves of a new population coming from the outside, such as the Israelites according to the biblical narrative, but rather an inner Palestine settlement process. In other words, the Gibeonites are just as Israelite as the people from Mitzpah, or from Anatot, or from those afterwards living in Jerusalem. In order to understand the story of the Gibeonites, we first must understand the rules of war in the book of Deuteronomy. The rules of war in the book of Deuteronomy were aimed, the original rules of war, were aimed at limiting destruction and bloodshed in times of warfare, and therefore it required first offering terms of peace and capitulation, and only if those were rejected, then was it possible to conquer a town. When that was done, then the men would be put to death and booty would be taken from women, children, livestock, and everything else. There is nothing within this original section of the war that implies that it is dealing with exceptional cases rather than the rule. However, within the broader context, we find a sudden restriction that's introduced that makes a distinction between towns which are very far away, in other words, outside of Canaan, and the Canaanite towns. This distinction limits the application of the section that we discussed earlier and implies that it only is enforced regarding non-Canaanite towns, the towns which are very far away. The new section deals with herem, or the ban, and it requires that all the towns of Canaan automatically be put to the ban, in which all of the inhabitants of the town are put to death. The rationale for this is that so that the indigenous people would not lead the Israelites to stray and adopt their pagan Canaanite religious practices. The story of the Gibeonites presumes the background of the ban law in the book of Deuteronomy and is built around it. In fact, the Gibeonites display surprising familiarity with the law of the ban. When they hear about the fate of Jericho and Ai, the cities which had previously been conquered and put to the ban, the Gibeonites take steps to preserve themselves and to look after their own future. They represent themselves as coming from afar and show material evidence that bolsters their claim. And then they demand that the Israelites make a pact with them. The Israelites indeed fall into the trap and make a peace treaty with them. And later, when they discover the truth that the Gibeonites actually live nearby, they realize that they have been deceived. The Gibeonites' deception, as well as the Israelites' accusation upon discovering the truth, plays upon words which appear in the law of the ban on the distinction between near and far. At the beginning, the Israelites are reluctant And they say, perhaps you live in our midst, which in Hebrew is the same as the word for to be near, karov. Then how can we make a pact with you? And afterwards, when they discover the deception, they accuse the Gibeonites. Why did you deceive us, saying, we live very far from you, when you actually dwell in our midst? Afterwards, the Gibeonites justify what they have done with words which betray knowledge of the law of the ban. For your servants heard that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to wipe out all the inhabitants of the land for your sake. So we were in great fear for our lives. One would think that the Gibeonites had been studying the book of Deuteronomy. Other details of the story are inspired by other late passages in the book of Deuteronomy. For example, the Gibeonites' disguise consists of worn-out clothes and sandals, moldy bread, and dried-up wineskins, and all of these would be inspected if the Gibeonites indeed came from afar, as they claim. This description stands in inverse relation to the description of how God provided for the Israelites on their lengthy wanderings in the desert at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, when they had no bread to eat and no wine to drink, and miraculously their clothes and their sandals were preserved and did not experience wear and tear. The Israelites, of course, discovered the deception too late, after they had already sworn in the name of God to respect the terms of the treaty. And they could not afterwards correct the situation by inflicting the ban retrospectively. Instead, they tried to minimize the damage, and they decided to devote the Gibeonites to be temple servants and to serve as wood choppers and water drawers in the temple. Now, this expression, wood chopper and water drawer, occurs only one place other in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 29. And there it occurs in a section that details the standing of the various people who will enter into covenant with God. And it states there that even strangers, in other words, foreigners, and menial workers, such as wood choppers and water drawers, will be partners to the covenant with God. The motif of the distant foreigner who comes to the land of Canaan also occurs in a sermon at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. There, the section foresees that a foreigner will come from a distant land and will behold in amazement the devastation with which God has afflicted Israel after it has broken the covenant with God. The Gibeonites also claim that they come from a distant land. However, they come in order to induce the Israelites to break their covenant with God and instead make a treaty with them, all of which is forbidden by the book of Deuteronomy. Finally, the Gibeonites are ironically represented as pious foreigners. In fact, they appear to be quoting the words of Solomon's prayer on the dedication of the temple, from a section that foresees that a foreigner in a distant land will have heard about God's name and of all of his actions and will come to pray to him at the temple in Jerusalem. This passage of Solomon's prayer is similar in spirit to the words of an anonymous prophet that were appended to the end of the book of Isaiah, which speak of foreigners who attach themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, and to love the name of the Lord and be his servants. The Gibeonites attempt to allay the fears of the Israelites and represent themselves as having come to establish a treaty with the Israelites because they had heard about God's great name and all that he had done. All of this is to establish their claims to be people from a distant land who are pious and God-fearing. By the end of the story, the Gibeonites are indeed finally attached to the temple, but as menial servants rather than as pious worshippers. So what can we conclude from all of this? First of all, the story of the Gibeonites is a story about deception, and it invites us to identify with the successful tricksters who save themselves from a bad end, rather than with those who have had the wool pulled over their eyes. Here, the Gibeonites circumvent the ideology of the ban law in the book of Deuteronomy that requires that all of the inhabitants of Canaanite be put to death. And it does this by utilizing motifs from the book of Deuteronomy itself. Neither the story nor any other part of the book of Joshua condemns the Israelites for not having implemented the ban on the Gibeonites, and nowhere do we hear that they are required to rectify the situation or are blamed for not rectifying the situation. This would seem to imply, in my opinion, that the story is actually a polemic against the ideology behind the law of the ban in the book of Deuteronomy. In other words, it is arguing against this law. The purpose and tendency of the story of the Gibeonites, I think, implies a situation in which there was concern with the relations between those who considered themselves to be the people of Israel and an indigenous other. This points to in my opinion, to the Persian period, when members of the diaspora returned back to Judah, and their claims to a patrimony were countered by those who had remained in the land throughout the Babylonian conquest and afterwards. Those who maintained a Judean identity in the diaspora now found themselves a minority in Judah. And they could identify with the stories in the book of Joshua that marginalized the indigenous other. However, in the Persian period, there was no escaping the fact that this indigenous other, or the people of the land, according to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, this indigenous other were actually comprised of people who worshipped the God of Israel. And this would seem to undermine the rationale of the law of the ban, which was based upon the claim that the indigenous people would lead the Israelites astray and no longer observe orthodox Yahwistic practices. Accordingly, the diaspora Judeans must have had to revise their ideology dealing with how to relate to the people of the land, those who had remained in Judah. I think that the story of the Gibeonites is actually a literary expression of a contemporaneous debate during the Persian period regarding the nature of the relations, or the nature of the proper relations, between the diaspora Judeans who had returned and between those who had remained all along in Judah. On the one hand, we find an extremist position, which is represented by the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the indigenous inhabitants are considered adversaries and foreigners, rather than as Judeans who had simply remained. And they are denied a place within the community and denied any part in building the temple, even though they themselves are Yahweh worshipers. They worship the God of Israel. I think the Gibeonite story counters this tendency, this extremist tendency, and instead proposes a compromise. The people of the land who are represented in the book of Joshua by the Gibeonites are allowed to take a part in the Israelite cult, although in a subservient position. So here we can see that a story that seems to be relating to the conquest is actually relating to the situation that the social and religious situation attaining in Judah in the Persian period. Accordingly, I think that the story, at least the story that we have before us regarding the deception of the Gibeonites and the way they achieve their treaty and the way the entire story is formulated, is a product of the Persian period.